For most people, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a tale of divine condemnation, a grim warning engraved in the pages of the Bible, synonymous with sin and destruction. But what if I told you that the narrative you know is only the tip of the iceberg? That there are layers of truth, context, and complexity that have been conveniently omitted or misinterpreted over the centuries. Get ready to unravel one of the most enduring mysteries of Scripture, a story whose true meaning may shock you and, at the same time, offer urgent lessons for our own era. If you are ready to challenge what you have always believed and dive into the depths of a forgotten truth, click the subscribe button now and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our deep investigations. Our journey begins not with a cliché of sexual immorality, but with a much broader panorama of the society of the time. The cities of the plains, Sodom and Gomorrah, were not mere dens of perversion. They were prosperous metropolises, strategically located in a fertile region irrigated by the Jordan River. Their wealth was legendary, their markets bustling with commerce, and their lands envied. This setting of abundance is crucial to understanding what truly led to their downfall. For prosperity is often a fertile ground for complacency and for a different kind of moral degradation than what is usually preached. The Bible gives us glimpses of this wealth. Lot, Abraham's nephew, when separating from his uncle, chose the plain of the Jordan, which was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Genesis 13 verse 10. This description evokes an image of paradise, an oasis of opulence that attracted people and resources. Yet this same abundance, which should have generated gratitude and generosity, seems to have cultivated arrogance and self-sufficiency that became the seed of their own destruction. Isolated in their bubble of prosperity, they became blind to the outside world and to the needs of others. But what was the truth hidden behind this facade of wealth and sin? The traditional narrative focuses almost exclusively on the sexual aspect, but later biblical texts and historical analyses suggest that the sins of Sodom were far more extensive and insidious. It was not just about specific acts, but a systemic failure of character, a deep social corruption that undermined the pillars of the community. Justice, hospitality, and compassion, fundamental values in the ancient Middle Eastern culture, appear to have been replaced by selfishness and oppression. Therefore, instead of merely a divine judgment on sexual perversion, what we truly see in Sodom and Gomorrah is a case study on the collapse of a society that lost its moral compass. It is a story about the consequences of wealth without responsibility, power without empathy, and self-indulgence that ignores the suffering of others. As we peel back these layers, we begin to see that the lessons of Sodom and Gomorrah are frighteningly relevant to the ethical and social challenges we face in our own time, proving that history repeats itself when its true messages are ignored. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, as we know it, often omits the socio-economic context that preceded it, a crucial element for understanding the depth of their fall. The cities of the Jordan Plain did not arise out of nowhere as centers of depravity. They were, in fact, commercial jewels, located along strategic routes and blessed with natural resources such as bitumen, which was valuable for construction and mummification. This prosperity, instead of being a motor for collective well-being, ironically became the foundation of their ruin. Historical and archaeological records, though scarce and debated regarding the exact location of the cities, point to an area of great economic activity during the Bronze Age. The abundance of water and the fertility of the soil allowed prosperous agriculture, while the geographic location favored trade. This wealth, however, was not distributed equitably. Instead of fostering a just and compassionate society, it appears to have produced a powerful elite and a system that oppressed the most vulnerable, a seed of corruption that grew and suffocated any remaining virtue. The prophet Ezekiel, centuries later, offers one of the most enlightening descriptions of the true sin of Sodom, expanding the view far beyond sexual transgressions. In Ezekiel 16 verses 49 to 50, he states, "Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and prosperous ease she and her daughters had. But she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. They were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. This passage is a turning point, revealing that the central failure of Sodom was its arrogance and social neglect. The pride and fullness of bread, combined with the prosperous ease, paint a picture of a society that had become complacent in its wealth. They had everything they needed and more, but failed to recognize the responsibility that came with such abundance. The absence of reaching out to the poor and the needy is a devastating indictment, suggesting that hospitality, a pillar of ancient Near Eastern culture and a divine virtue, had been completely abandoned in favor of selfishness and exclusion. Thus, the true sin of Sodom was not merely the practice of specific sexual acts, but the manifestation of profound social injustice and the absence of charity. Hospitality, which was sacred especially toward strangers and travelers, had been perverted. Wealth led to arrogance, arrogance to indifference, and indifference to oppression. This is the formation and context of Sodom and Gomorrah, not a place of random perversion, but a society that, despite its material prosperity, had become morally bankrupt, paving the way for its own judgment. At the heart of a narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah, we find the complex figure of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Lot was not a native of those cities, but a foreigner who chose to settle there, attracted by the lushness of the Jordan Plain. His story is a fascinating study of a man divided, caught between the values of his family heritage and the seduction of a prosperous but morally compromised society. His trajectory offers us a window into the real challenges of maintaining integrity in a corrosive environment. Lot is initially presented as a righteous man. The second epistle of Peter describes him as righteous Lot, oppressed by the licentious conduct of the wicked. 2 Peter 2 verse 7. This description is crucial, for it suggests that Lot did not conform to the perverse practices of Sodom. However, his righteousness was constantly tested by his proximity to iniquity. He chose to live among the Sodomites, perhaps believing he could maintain his faith and values intact while enjoying the wealth of the region. This decision, however, placed him in a precarious position from which it would be difficult to escape unscathed. His choice to move to Sodom was driven by practical and economic considerations. After a dispute between the herdsmen of Abraham and Lot, Abraham offered Lot the first choice of land. Lot, seeing the Jordan Plain as a paradise, chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan. Genesis 13 verse 11. This decision, though seemingly pragmatic, revealed a priority that distanced him from Abraham's path, which sought a land promised by God. Lot pursued convenience and material prosperity, a choice that would come with a high spiritual and moral cost. The challenges Lot faced were real and progressive. Initially, he pitched his tents near Sodom, Genesis 13 verse 12, indicating proximity but not full residence. Over time, he integrated more deeply, eventually sitting at the city gate, a position of respect and influence, Genesis 19 verse 1. This suggests Lot was not merely a passive resident, but someone who had risen socially in Sodom, actively participating in civic life. This integration, however, exposed him even more to corruption and made him a reluctant accomplice to the city's moral decay. Lot's life is a poignant reminder that proximity to temptation and the relentless pursuit of material advantage can corrode even the most righteous. His struggle to preserve his family and his own soul amid the depravity of Sodom is one of the most human and tragic aspects of the story. He was not a villain, but a flawed man whose crucial decisions led him to a point of no return, where his faith and morality would be tested in unimaginable ways, revealing the complexity of the human condition in the face of worldly seduction. Part 4. Divine Justice and Abraham's Intercession, an Unexpected Dialogue. The impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not an impulsive act, but the climax of a process of degradation. Before the catastrophe fell, the biblical narrative presents us with one of the most remarkable and profoundly human dialogues between God and Abraham, a moment that reveals the complexity of divine justice and the deep compassion of a man. This episode, often underestimated, is essential to understanding the nature of judgment and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. God reveals to Abraham his plans to visit Sodom and Gomorrah, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous. Genesis 18 verse 20. This outcry is not merely human lament, but an expression of the deep injustice and oppression permeating these cities. The sin had reached a saturation point, requiring divine intervention. Yet what follows is not an immediate condemnation, but an opportunity for Abraham to intercede, revealing a God who does not act arbitrarily, but with consideration for justice and mercy. Abraham's intercession is a series of bold yet humble negotiations. He begins by asking, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Genesis 18 verse 23, arguing that the judge of all the earth would surely act justly. Abraham, with an audacity bordering on irreverence, but tempered by deep faith, bargains with God, reducing the number of righteous needed to spare the city from 50 to 45, then to 40, 30, 20, and finally just 10. This dialogue shows the persistence of Abraham's faith and the surprising receptiveness of God to human plea. This moment is not only a demonstration of Abraham's compassion for Lot and his family, but also an insight into God's character. He is not a distant tyrant, but a being willing to listen and reconsider, even in the face of a decree of judgment. The requirement to spare the city, the presence of merely 10 righteous people, underscores the idea that the salvation of a community can depend on a small remnant of upright individuals. Unfortunately, not even this minimum number could be found in Sodom, sealing its fate. The crucial decisions in this episode are twofold: the divine decision to investigate and judge the outcry against the cities, and Abraham's decision to intercede fervently. The complex legacy of this dialogue lies in the tension between divine justice and mercy, and in the idea that intercession can indeed influence the course of events. It teaches us that justice is not blind, but considers the presence of virtue, and that the voice of a righteous person can sometimes be the last thread of hope for a society on the brink of ruin. A powerful human lesson about individual responsibility. With the divine decision sealed and Abraham's intercession concluded, 2 angels, in the form of men, are sent to Sodom. Their arrival is a crucial moment, serving as a final test for the morality of the society and revealing the true depth of its depravity. What happens next is not merely an isolated incident, but the manifestation of the abomination that Ezekiel would describe centuries later: the complete absence of hospitality and the practice of oppression against the outsider. At evening, Lot was sitting at the gate of the city, a position of prominence indicating his integration into Sodom's civic life. He sees the 2 strangers and immediately recognizes the importance of hospitality. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." Genesis 19 verse 2. This is the expected response in a culture where hospitality was a sacred virtue, a protection for travelers, and an expression of respect. Lot's readiness to offer shelter sharply contrasts with the behavior of the other inhabitants. The angels initially refuse, saying they would spend the night in the square. Their refusal may have been a test to verify the genuineness of Lot's offer and the safety of the city. However, Lot insists strongly, and they finally agree. This detail is significant. Lot knew what would happen if the strangers remained in the square, exposed to the perverted hospitality of the Sodomites. His insistence demonstrates his awareness of the imminent danger and perhaps his desperate attempt to protect himself and his guests from an anticipated tragedy. Night had barely begun when Sodom's true nature revealed itself. Before the angels could lie down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people without exception. Genesis 19 verse 4. What they wanted was not to offer hospitality, but to sexually abuse the strangers. Their demand: "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Genesis 19 verse 5. The word know, yada in Hebrew, in this context is clearly used in the sense of sexual relations, a flagrant violation of the social and moral norms of the time. This episode is not only about a specific sexual act. It concerns the total absence of empathy, respect, and the rights of the outsider. The crowd, composed of all the people without exception, shows that corruption was not limited to a small group, but had deeply taken root in the entire society. The violation of hospitality, the aggression against the defenseless, and the demand for sexual violence reveal a society that had completely lost its moral compass, confirming the gravity of the outcry that had reached the heavens and sealing the city's fate. The most common interpretation of the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah focuses almost exclusively on homosexuality, to the point where the term sodomy has become synonymous with non-heterosexual acts. However, this is a drastic simplification that ignores the textual richness and the many biblical references that paint a much more complex and, for some, shocking picture. The truth behind the sin of Sodom is far more extensive and socially rooted than most religious leaders dare admit, challenging a superficial and moralistic understanding. As already mentioned, the prophet Ezekiel 16:49-50 is perhaps the most explicit in describing the true sins of Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and prosperous ease she and her daughters had, but she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. They were haughty and committed abomination before me. This passage is a powerful testimony that Sodom's central fault was not just sexual, but a deep social injustice. Pride and indifference toward the vulnerable are placed at the forefront, revealing a society that failed in its most basic duties of charity and equity. The fullness of bread and prosperous ease indicate that Sodom had ample resources to care for all, but chose not to. The refusal to strengthen the hand of the poor and needy is a direct condemnation of their lack of charity and their social oppression. In a culture where hospitality was almost a sacred command, refusing to shelter and feed the stranger or the needy was a grave transgression. This is not merely a sin of omission, but an active demonstration of cruelty and selfishness that went against divine precepts for treating one's neighbor. Other biblical passages corroborate this broader view. Isaiah 1 verses 10-17 compares the leaders of Jerusalem to those of Sodom, condemning them for failing to do justice to the fatherless and plead the cause of the widow. Likewise, Jeremiah 23 verse 14 accuses the prophets of Jerusalem of being like those of Sodom and Gomorrah, practicing adultery and walking in falsehood, and strengthening the hands of evildoers, so that no one turns from wickedness. These references show that, for the prophets, Sodom was a symbol of widespread moral corruption, not just sexual. Therefore, while the violent and coercive sexual act against the angels is undeniably part of the story, it must be viewed as the extreme manifestation of a much deeper social disease: the loss of empathy, the oppression of the weak, the arrogance of wealth, and the total failure of hospitality. The truth that many religious leaders may have conveniently ignored is that Sodom was not destroyed solely because of sexual sin, but because of a complete collapse of social justice and human decency. A warning that resonates powerfully in any society that ignores the suffering of its marginalized. At the height of the crisis in Sodom, when the enraged mob demanded that Lot hand over his guests for abuse, Lot makes a decision that shocks and disturbs modern readers. He offers his 2 virgin daughters to the men of the city, saying, "Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Genesis 19 verse 8. This act, at first glance, seems like an unthinkable and morally abhorrent betrayal, but it is crucial to analyze it within the cultural context and values of the time to attempt to understand his motivations. Hospitality in the ancient Middle East was a sacred obligation. The host had the absolute duty to protect his guests, even if it meant risking his own life or that of his family. Violating hospitality was one of the greatest offenses one could commit, both against the host and against God himself. Lot, in offering his daughters, was, in his distorted and desperate mind, attempting to fulfill the command of hospitality, protecting his guests at all costs. He prioritized the safety of the strangers, whom he believed were under his divine protection, above the honor of his daughters. This decision, though morally repugnant to us, reveals the complexity and sometimes brutality of the codes of honor and duty of that time. A man's honor was intrinsically tied to his ability to protect his guests. Additionally, Women, unfortunately, had a very different social status and were often viewed, in certain contexts, as property or as means to guarantee family safety. Lot's offer, therefore, cannot be justified, but it can be understood as an extreme act of desperation, a frantic attempt to avoid an even greater tragedy. In his perspective, the fact that the men of Sodom reject Lot's offer and insist on the strangers is even more revealing of their depravity. They were not interested in women, but in demonstrating power, humiliating the foreigner, and violating social and moral order. Their rejection of Lot's offer shows that their intention was not merely sexual, but about domination and degradation. They wanted the men not just to satisfy desire, but to assert supremacy and impose their will on anyone who dared oppose them, including Lot, the foreigner who had settled among them. The unthinkable offense of Lot, though horrific, serves to illuminate the moral darkness of Sodom. It forces us to confront the brutality of ancient times and the complexity of ethical choices in extreme situations. Lot, the righteous man living among the wicked, was so immersed in the corruption of the city that his own values became distorted, leading him to a decision that would stain his reputation forever. It is a somber human lesson about how social pressure and desperation can drive even the good to terrible acts, and how the line between right and wrong can blur in a world without a moral compass. The refusal of the crowd of Sodom to accept Lot's offer and their insistence on violating the guests marks the point of no return for the city. This moment is not merely an isolated incident of violence, but the culmination of a culture of arrogance, injustice, and total disrespect for human life and for divine order. The blindness of the crowd, their inability to recognize the gravity of their actions, and the subsequent imposition of the ultimatum by the angels seals Sodom's fate irreversibly. After Lot's shocking offer, the crowd does not back down. Instead, they become even more enraged. Then they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he wants to play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door. Genesis 19 verse 9. The reaction of the crowd is a glimpse into the mindset of Sodom. They would not tolerate any form of moral authority or criticism, especially from a foreigner like Lot. Their fury and threats of violence against him reveal a society that had lost all sense of reason and self-reflection. At this critical moment, the angels intervene, but the men put forth their hand, pulled Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out trying to find the door. Genesis 19 verses 10 to 11. This blindness is not only physical, but symbolic. The crowd was already morally blind, unable to see the depravity of their own actions. The physical blindness imposed by the angels is an outward manifestation of their inner condition, a punishment that prevents them from carrying out their evil intention, and a final warning. With the door secured and the crowd disoriented, the angels reveal their true identity and mission. They give Lot the final ultimatum: "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the iniquity of the city. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Genesis 19 verses 12 to 13. There is no more time for negotiations or intercessions. Judgment is imminent, and the only option is immediate flight. The blindness of the crowd and the ultimatum of the angels represent the point of no return. The society of Sodom had exhausted all chances of redemption, refusing to acknowledge their sins and persisting in violence and injustice. The human lessons here are profound. Arrogance and the refusal to accept truth can lead to inevitable ruin. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just an account of punishment, but a testimony to the importance of self-awareness, humility, and the ability to change before it is too late, reminding us that moral blindness is more dangerous than physical blindness. With the angel's ultimatum echoing in his ears, Lot and his family find themselves in a desperate race against time. The destruction of Sodom is imminent, and their survival depends on immediate and unquestioning obedience to divine instructions. This moment is charged with suspense and symbolism, revealing not only the urgency of the situation, but also the difficulty of detaching oneself from a past, even when that past is about to be consumed by fire. The angels hurry Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters, seizing them by the hand and leading them out of the city, for the mercy of the Lord was upon them. Genesis 19 verse 16. This direct intervention underscores Lot's reluctance to leave everything behind. Despite witnessing the depravity of the city and the looming threat, there is hesitation, an enduring attachment to the life he had built there. It is a human portrayal of the difficulty of abandoning what is familiar, even if toxic, and of the need for divine pressure for salvation. The angel's instructions are clear and absolute. Flee for your life. Do not look behind you, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountain, lest you be consumed. Genesis 19 verse 17. Every part of this command is crucial. Flee for your life emphasizes urgency. Do not look behind you warns against nostalgia, curiosity, or regret that could bind the soul to what is being destroyed. Do not stop in all the plain reiterates the need for a complete break with a condemned environment. And flee to the mountain points to safety, a place of refuge and separation. Lot, however, still reveals his fallibility. He hesitates to go to the mountain, fearing the disaster will overtake him. Instead, he pleads to flee to a small nearby city, Zor. Please, my lord, let your servant find favor in your eyes. Let me escape to that little town. It is only a small one, and my life will be spared. Genesis 19 verses 18 to 20. The angels, in mercy, grant his request and spare Zor for Lot's sake. This concession once again demonstrates divine patience and God's willingness to accommodate human weakness, as long as there is genuine desire to escape condemnation. Lot's flight with his family is a dramatic climax, a turning point dividing the before and after. It is a powerful lesson about decisive action in the face of impending judgment and about completely severing ties with a past that pulls us downward. But the story is not over, and the temptation to look back will prove fatal for one member of Lot's family, revealing that partial obedience can have devastating consequences. If you are finding value in this deep exploration and want to continue uncovering the hidden truths of Scripture, don't forget to like and share this video. Your engagement helps us bring more content like this. Lot's escape with his family, which should have been an act of unanimous salvation, is tragically marked by one member's disobedience. Lot's wife, despite the clear instruction from the angels not to look back, turns to gaze upon the destruction of Sodom and is instantly transformed into a pillar of salt. This event is not merely a picturesque detail, but one of the most powerful and enigmatic warnings in the Bible, a timeless testimony about the dangers of nostalgia, indecision, and attachment to a condemned past. The command, "Do not look back," was not arbitrary. It represented the need for a total break from the lifestyle, values, and attractions of the city that was being judged. Looking back was not merely an act of curiosity, but a symbol of attachment, of regret for what was being lost. For Lot's wife, Sodom was not just a sinful place, but her home, the place of her memories, possibly her friendships and identity. Her act of looking back revealed a heart still tied to that reality. The transformation into a pillar of salt is both literal and symbolic. Salt in antiquity was often used to sterilize soil, rendering it barren and desolate. Becoming salt was thus a symbol of barrenness, death, and final destiny. Additionally, the region of the Dead Sea is rich in salt formations, which may give geographical context, but the spiritual meaning is paramount. Lot's wife becomes a permanent monument to disobedience and the ruin caused by the inability to abandon what God was judging. Her legacy is complex and multifaceted. Jesus Christ, in Luke 17 verse 32, references her directly. Remember Lot's wife. This exhortation is not merely historical, but a prophetic warning to his followers about the dangers of attachment to material things and worldly attractions, especially in view of the coming kingdom of God. She symbolizes the divided soul that tries to serve two masters and, in doing so, loses everything. Her story stands as a warning about urgency and total commitment when facing divine principles of justice and salvation. The human lessons of Lot's wife are profound. She teaches us about the power of nostalgia and the danger of clinging to what is rotten or condemned. Her tragedy is a reminder that salvation requires a radical break from a sinful past and unconditional obedience to divine will. Her pillar of salt remains a silent witness that sometimes the greatest danger is not the external enemy, but hesitation and the inability to leave behind what binds us to destruction. Her story is an eternal call to look ahead, to salvation, rather than backward, to ruin. With Lot's family safe in Zoar, the curtain rises on the most dramatic scene in the story, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible describes the event with vivid and terrifying imagery. Then the Lord rained sulfur and fire from the Lord out of the heavens on Sodom and Gomorrah. And he overthrew those cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. Genesis 19 verses 24 to 25. This description raises questions about the nature of the catastrophe and whether there is historical or geological evidence that might corroborate the biblical account. The phrase fire and sulfur strongly suggests a volcanic-like event or a natural explosion involving fossil fuels. The region of the Dead Sea, where the cities are believed to have been located, is geologically active. It lies along the Great Rift Valley, marked by earthquakes, geological faults, and the presence of bitumen and natural gas, which are highly flammable. The possibility of a massive earthquake that released underground gas, ignited by lightning or another natural trigger, is a theory many scholars consider to explain the fire from heaven. Over the years, various archaeological expeditions have searched for the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, with several sites proposed as possible locations. Tel El Hammam in Jordan is a recent candidate gaining attention, with evidence of catastrophic destruction by an extreme heat event, which some interpret as an airburst explosion, similar to a meteor exploding in the atmosphere, consistent with the description of fire from the sky. Other sites, like Bab Edra and Nemera, have also been suggested, though evidence remains debated. The historical impact of this destruction is undeniable, regardless of the exact natural cause. The event solidified Sodom and Gomorrah as symbols of divine judgment and catastrophic consequences for iniquity. The image of cities consumed by fire and sulfur has become an archetype of end-times judgment, resonating across religious and cultural traditions as a sobering reminder of civilization's fragility in the face of divine or natural force. More than a physical catastrophe, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah represents the climax of a society that condemned itself. It is a testimony to the power of nature, whether orchestrated by God or operating under his laws, to erase arrogance and injustice. The human lessons here underscore the importance of living in harmony with ethical and spiritual principles, and the recognition that material prosperity without moral responsibility can lead to self-annihilation. The smoke rising from the earth, seen by Abraham, was the sign of a tragic end, but also the beginning of a legacy of warning and reflection. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the tragic loss of Lot's wife, the story of Lot and his daughters takes an even darker and more controversial turn, revealing the moral complexity and consequences of living in a collapsing society. Taking refuge in a cave, Lot's daughters, fearing that no men remain to preserve their lineage, devise a plan that results in one of the most disturbing episodes in Scripture: incest with their own father. The Bible recounts that the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve our father's lineage." Genesis 19 verses 31 to 32. This decision, though shocking, must be understood in the context of the trauma and isolation they experienced. The destruction of the cities and the loss of their mother left them desperate and fearful that their lineage would die out, a source of great shame in ancient culture. They carry out the plan over 2 consecutive nights, and Lot, drunk, is unaware of what is happening. Both daughters become pregnant by their father. The older gives birth to Moab, father of the Moabites, The younger gives birth to Ben-Ammi, father of the Ammonites. Genesis 19 verses 37 to 38. This is the complex and controversial legacy of Lot's daughters. The origin of two nations neighboring Israel, often in conflict with the descendants of Abraham. This episode serves several narrative and theological purposes. First, it illustrates the far-reaching consequences of life in Sodom. Even after escaping physically, the trauma and distorted morality of the city appear to have deeply affected Lot's daughters, leading them to desperate and ethically questionable actions. Second, it explains the origin of two nations historically at odds with Israel, providing a basis for the hostility and the prohibitions against intermarriage in Mosaic law. The human lessons here are complex and uncomfortable. The story forces us to confront the extremes to which despair and fear can push people, and how trauma can distort moral judgment. It also reminds us that the actions of one generation can shape the destiny of many others, influencing the future of entire nations. It is a dark but essential chapter revealing the intricate web of cause and effect in biblical history, and the enduring stain of iniquity, even after divine judgment. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah transcends the account of an ancient catastrophe. It has become a powerful archetype with a complex legacy echoing across millennia. Yet the popular interpretation, focused almost entirely on sexual sin, has obscured its rich lessons and the true scope of its warning. The truth your religious leaders never told you lies in understanding that Sodom is a mirror for society, reflecting not just individual failings, but the collapse of an entire moral and social structure. The legacy of Sodom, as outlined by the prophets and even by Jesus, is multifaceted. It is not just a story about illicit sexual acts, but about the systemic corruption of a society. Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah expand the concept of the sin of Sodom to include pride, excessive prosperity without generosity, social injustice, oppression of the poor and needy, lack of hospitality, and general moral permissiveness. These are the true abominations that led to its condemnation, and they have often been conveniently overlooked in many modern sermons. This broader vision of Sodom's sin is crucial because it makes the story frighteningly relevant to our own era. In a world of growing social inequality, where wealth concentrates in the hands of few while many suffer, Ezekiel's warning against abundance of bread and idle prosperity, without strengthening the hand of the poor and needy, resonates urgently. Indifference to the marginalized, arrogance of power, and exploitation of the vulnerable are direct echoes of Sodom's sins, rarely addressed with the same intensity as sexual issues. The lack of hospitality, culminating in attempted abuse of foreigners, is a reminder of the danger of a society that shuts its doors to the other, demonizing the stranger and failing to protect the weak. In a time of migration crises and growing divides, Sodom's story invites reflection on how we treat those at society's margins and whether we are fulfilling the biblical mandate to welcome the foreigner. Thus, Sodom's legacy is a call to deep reflection on humanity's moral condition and society's responsibilities. It warns that material prosperity without ethical foundation, selective justice, lack of compassion, and collective arrogance can lead to ruin, regardless of religion or era. The fuller truth about Sodom and Gomorrah is that the story is not merely one of fire and brimstone, but a mirror inviting us to examine the moral foundations of our own cities and hearts before the outcry of injustice becomes too loud to ignore. We have reached the end of our journey through the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, but the lessons we have drawn are far from buried beneath the ashes of time. The full truth of these cities, often obscured by simplistic interpretations, reveals a narrative richer and more unsettling than commonly taught. It is not merely a judgment on sexuality, but on the total failure of a society's moral, ethical, and social pillars. It is the story of how wealth without responsibility, power without empathy, and arrogance without humility can lead to self-destruction, a warning that echoes with frightening clarity in our own age. What your religious leaders may never have emphasized enough is that Sodom was not condemned for one sin, but for a tapestry of iniquities. Pride, idleness, abundance of bread not shared with the poor and needy, total absence of hospitality, oppression, and violence against the foreigner, and yes, coercive sexual perversion, all interwove to form a pattern of depravity that reached heaven. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is, above all, a case study of the collapse of a civilization that lost its moral compass, focusing on itself while ignoring the cries of the vulnerable. Sodom's legacy is not intended to terrify us with fire and brimstone, but to invite profound reflection. It challenges us to look into our own communities and hearts. Are we, in our prosperity and comfort, extending a hand to the poor and needy? Are we practicing true hospitality, welcoming the outsider and marginalized? Or are we enclosing ourselves in bubbles of comfort and indifference? The story of Lot, a man torn between worlds, and the fate of his wife, unable to detach from the past, are poignant reminders of the need for clear choices and radical obedience when confronted with the divine principles of justice and love. This is the truth behind Sodom and Gomorrah, an eternal warning that true faith and righteousness are not shown in rituals or dogmas, but in how we treat one another. It is a call to action, to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly, transforming our societies from within. The greatest lesson is that destruction does not come from an angry God eager to punish, but from the inevitable consequences of our collective choices when injustice and lovelessness erode the fabric of our humanity. May the story of Sodom and Gomorrah serve not as a tale of terror, but as a beacon, illuminating the path toward a more just, compassionate, and truly human society. May we learn from the errors of the past to build a future where abundance of bread is shared, pride is replaced by humility, and tranquility is the fruit of peace and justice for all. If this exploration has stirred your thoughts and awakened your desire for deeper truths, I invite you to join us in our next video, where another biblical mystery awaits to challenge your understanding.